Silas Crow dropped to one knee, eyes cold as iron, and steadied his breath as the world narrowed to the notch in his sight. The morning wore a dull grey, like steel cooling after a blow. The railroad of mud and smoke between the lines steamed with the faint acrid bite of powder, and the oaks around him whispered with a wind that smelled of rain and sap and burnt memory. He pressed his lips tight, felt the rough wood grain bite through the leather of his gloves, and listened for the hammering of his own heart in his ears, as if the drum of the enemy's marching had crawled inside his chest. Silas Crow was a Confederate marksman, not a figure of legend, but a man with a single, stubborn vow to strike a decisive blow from the long grass and make the line rethink the distance between victory and death. The rifle he carried was a long, tight thing, cold as a winter night and deadly as a verdict. The men who stood near him, hunched beneath ragged coats and stained hats, whispered prayers in the same breath that cursed the Union lines. He felt their eyes as if they were hands on his shoulders, guiding him toward a choice he could not retreat from. "Quiet now," muttered a voice to his left, a card of a man with a scar that mapped half his face. "The Yanks are moving again. You'll have your moment, Silas, if you've the nerve to take it." The voice belonged to Rook, a lean sharpshooter with a voice like dry twigs snapping in a fire. He was both his ally and his mirror. A reminder of what careful patience could steal from a man. Hope, mercy, mercy, and the small piece of a future that might slip away on a crosswind. Silas did not answer aloud. The breath he took crossed his throat with a whisper of frost, and he let it go slowly, counting the breath down to 10, then to 1, then back again. The pulse of the battlefield moved like a living thing, a coarse animal with a smell of powder and iron and something else. Fear. Perhaps the private kind of fear that makes brave men take sudden, stupid chances. Across the field, the sun still hadn't deigned to rise, not really. The ground hid 1,000 small sounds. The whisper of a blade of grass, the tiny clink of a cartridge sleeve, the soft thud of a distant hoof. And then there came a change in the air, a difference in the way the wind carried the musk and the scent of rain, the shift of scent that tells a hunter a thing before his eyes betray him, a movement along the Union line, a line of men stepping out from behind a line of scrub that was more shadow than wood. They moved with the kind of heavy, measured certainty that comes with marching toward a target larger than life, a general perhaps, or at least a man who could become one in the eyes of a nation. "Convoy coming up," whispered Jethro, a soldier with a scar under his eye and a voice that always sounded like a thief's whisper. "If they bring him forward, you'll have a take on something bigger than a company." Silas did not nod. He did not even blink. He felt the world compress into a small, precise point behind the notch of his rifle, a circle of metal and wood and stubborn human will where nothing existed except the moment and the decision. He had learned long ago that a long shot was not about luck, but about patience, about listening to a creature other than your own fear, the kind of listening that could hear a heartbeat in 100 yards of smoke if you listened hard enough. Sell yourself to the distance. "Soldier," Rook murmured to him, as if reading his thoughts in the thin line of smoke that rose from the Union lines. "Tell me your name when you pull the trigger. Let the bullet write it for you." Silas's hands did not shake. He trusted in muscle memory, the way a man trusts the earth beneath him when the stars have gone blind and the night has become a liar. His finger found the trigger, his breath pressed down to the necessary rhythm, and his eyes drifted through the sight, past the thin line of men and the morning fog, to a figure that rose and dipped with the march of a column and the stubborn defiance of someone who believed himself safe because the line was thick, and the country huge, and the moment was a rumor rather than deadly. Truth. The day grew heavier with each passing moment, not with the pressure of incoming fire, but with the knowledge that a single shot could alter a river of history. The Confederate shrapnel had stories in its grooves, stories told in hushed voices, after the men had left behind the shells and their own frightened breath. Silas heard them even now in the rustle of coats and the distant clink of spurs, stories of men who looked at a distance and believed in certainty, only to learn that certainty dies in a field where distance is a trick of the sun, and the gun speaks with a cold, impartial voice. The line ahead settled into a slower movement, a careful, almost ceremonial approach toward the center of the field. The Union soldiers did not want to reveal themselves, but they moved with the confidence of men who believed the ground would shield them from the thunder of rifles forever. Sedgwick did not march at the head that day, because the general did not need to lead with his feet when his men moved in obedience to his will. He rode perhaps or walked perhaps, but the image of him was fixed in Silas's mind as a silhouette along the hedge of the field, a man who had learned to survive by reading other men's fears and turning them into steps of a giant's march. "Take your time," whispered Jethro. "Let him earn the fate you're about to give him. Don't waste the chance on some misread thing." Silas did not acknowledge the command in a word. His eyes found the thread of light around the officer, a small ridge where a pipe of smoke rose and hovered, where a distance around a corner of trees opened to a bright patch of ground where a man stood and turned and looked. Silas held his breath and studied the man's head and posture, the tilt of the helmet, the way the man's eyes scanned the field with that old, stubborn need to make sense of confusion by being in plain sight of danger. He could not see Sedgwick clearly, only the profile of a grand, terrifying figure in the enemy's mind, a commander who rode ahead of his own shadow with a certainty that a day marked by his name would become a page in history. "Silas," whispered Rook, a voice near his ear that did not belong to chance but to a promise. "If you time it, you'll pull it off. If not, you'll not only lose us the chance, but the gamble could cost your soul a night's sleep." Silas gave a slow, almost bored nod that said more than words could. He pressed tighter against the rifle, felt the cold of the metal against his cheek, and listened with his eyes for a sound that would prove the shot ready, the whisper of the forward noise, the slight tremor of those around him, and the leaf scrape of a branch that had no business being there. Now he breathed, not a call but a vow, a whispering of the future into a world of smoke and mud. A space opened in the line in front of him, the Union soldiers stepping back in fear or in caution or both. A brief moment, where the world seemed to pause in its war and lean in to listen to a bullet that would travel across a distance of memory, across the breadth of a battlefield that would neither forgive nor forget. The rifle's sound came like a slow violin bow drawn across a taut string, a deliberate cold note that rolled through the grass and into the air. The bullet found its mark with a small hiss, a sound that did not belong to any animal, but to the act of history forcing itself forward and into the skull of a living man. The moment after, the shot was a silence so complete that Silas heard his own blood moving in his ears as if a river had begun to flow inside his skull. The field around him seemed to tilt, the ground grew lighter, and the air took on a scent that could only be described as the smell of iron, newly drawn from a blacksmith's forge and rain that hadn't yet fallen but wanted to. Sedgwick. The man, the legend, did not go down at once, and for a breath or two the day did not tilt toward him or away from him. The general stood or staggered, a silhouette briefly visible in the grey light before he toppled, a puppet with its strings cut, a tree knocked sideways by a cruel wind. There was a sound, half a gasp, half a grunt, a murmur of command, before nothing but the ragged cough of life leaving its body and the sudden, sharp truth of a soldier's death sealing the moment. The moment, for Silas, did not end in the quiet of victory. It began in the loud, dangerous afterbirth of what a man does when he has changed the course of an entire field by one precise choice. He did not cheer or smile or even breathe with relief. He stood and listened for the next tree to shake and fall, for the next cry of a wounded man, for the next orders that would come down the line and tell him what his name would be in the days to come. "Did you see?" whispered a voice from behind him. Not Rook this time, but a new face, a stranger to Silas's world of close and careful observation, a young man with a tremor in his hands that never quite settled. "Did you see the look on his face when it happened?" Silas did not answer with noise. He turned slightly until he could see the soldier's eyes, shining with a curious mixture of awe and disbelief, as if the world had suddenly shifted to reveal a door he hadn't known existed. It was not pride that filled him or that other sense of victory that makes a man forget his own fear. It was something cooler and more uncertain, something like the thought that a thread has just been pulled from a woven cloth and now the pattern must be remade. "Keep steady," Silas said, not loud but with a voice that carried in the evening air and the breath of men who listened for orders that might never come. "There'll be a moment when they need us again." He did not boast. He did not pretend to know what would come next. He only knew what he had done and the gravity of what a man becomes when he is called to such precise action. A life could hinge on the margin of a breath, on the alignment of a line, on a distance measured with a soldier's patience and luck and skill. The battle that followed, the long night of gunfire and the sour taste of smoke, was not what Silas would have chosen for his revenge or his glory. It was a different, more stubborn kind of war, the war between memory and forgetfulness, between the moment when a man can alter a lifeline and the many days that would come after to test the truth of that alteration. The Union line crept and strained, the Confederate line pressed and held, and somewhere between the two a rumor grew in the smell of powder and rain that a certain day would be remembered for one moment, for a single, particular shot. In the days that followed, the men who survived the moment found themselves discussing what they had seen as if it were a thing outside themselves, a story that could be told and retold, a narrative they could hold up against the wind and the fear that gnawed their minds. Some said the general did not fall from the first shot, but later that a second bullet had found him in the leg, or in the throat, or in some place that did not care to reveal itself to the world. Others claimed the mark was a cleaner hit than anything they had seen, and that the general had died with a certain dignity, a look on his face like a man who realized too late that distance was a lie he had believed in for too long. Silas listened to these stories with a quiet patience that surprised even him. He never lied about what happened. He did not pretend to know the exact chain of events beyond the one the world would one day accept as truth. He spoke softly when asked for his opinion, and the words he offered were careful and true as he could make them and no more. He did not seek glory for this shot. He understood that glory was the burden of the man who could not bear to admit how small a thing a man can be in the face of history, and how heavy a thing a single bullet can prove to be in the hands of someone who would not forget what he did. The memory of that day, the day Sedgwick fell, did not vanish for Silas as many things had. In the heat and the distance of war, it settled into him like a scar that refuses to fade, a reminder of what one mark can mean when it travels through a field of bones and mud, and the unspoken prayers of men who believed themselves to be fighting for a cause that was both noble and ruinous. That haunted him in the quiet hours of the night, when the fire burned down to ashes, and the world of smoke seemed to breathe heavier than it should. "Why did you do it?" asked a tavern keeper, in a memory that came to him in a dream. A man who never saw him but who asked the question anyway. For there are some questions that every man who holds a gun must answer when the war is done, and the day has grown small, and the heart begins to speak again in the language of guilt and pride. Silas had no question to offer that could satisfy the dream-teller of a memory. He could only tell the night that he stood in the rain and smoke with the weight of all that distance between him and the life he might have led if he had chosen differently, if the rifle had not been there at the ready, if the world had offered him a different fate. He would have given anything to let go of the feeling that this single moment had made him something else. A killer, a guardian, a man without the right to claim a future that wouldn't be sullied by the memory of a single, accurate shot. In the end, the field spoke for him. The war did not remember him with the loud thunder of muskets, nor did history record the exact name of the man who pulled the trigger and changed the fates of many. The only thing remembered was the act itself, the moment in which Sedgwick received a wound in the head that would end his life and alter the course of the field and the pages of a nation's memory. And the words the general spoke in his last instant were to be recorded, not as a boast or a curse, but as the echo of a distance that the man who fired the shot would never quite escape from. "It is not the distance that matters," Silas later told the few who asked him what it had felt like to pull the trigger, "but the resolve to do what you believe must be done, even when the world tells you you cannot be sure of the outcome." He never argued the point with those who would argue back. He simply offered a few measured words and a look that said without a sound that he had carried a heavy burden and would carry it to the end of his days. During the long hours that followed the incident, Silas found himself confronted by questions from others. "What did you see when the shot landed?" pleaded a captain who had once considered Silas a mere rifleman and nothing more. "Did you hear him fall? Did you hear the crowd?" The captain's words were a mix of curiosity and fear, a hunger to know the truth of the day and to prove to his own soul that what happened was real and not simply a story that soldiers tell to quiet their restless minds. "I saw the air brake," Silas would answer, speaking in the careful, quiet tone he had learned to use when telling the truth without anger. I heard a hurt sound in the ground, and then I saw him go down as if the weight of the world had dropped on him from above. He would pause, then add almost as an afterthought, and I heard the men around him cry out. They are not always careful in the moment, but they know what a life looks like when it comes out of a man's skull in such a field. The day after the shot, as the smoke began to lift and the ground turned from brown to damp grey, Silas walked along the edge of the field with a small group of men who did not speak much, but carried themselves with a careful gravity that came from having stood on the line where life both begins and ends in a single breath. They spoke in whispers about distance and aim and luck, and whether a single spark could become a flame that would burn them all. Silas listened to their words without interrupting, a man who understood that talk was the second weapon in a war, the one you could use to cover your fear or to dispense your guilt, or to remind your friends that they had a claim to a future that might be worth fighting for. The remaining days of that spring and the long blistering summer that followed carried with them the memory of what had happened in a place that looked ordinary on a map, but not in the hearts of those who had seen the field. Silas watched the Union lines drift and reposition themselves, the Confederate lines hold, the ground harden with exhaustion and stubbornness. He listened to the sound of rifles in the distance, the sigh of old trees bending in the wind, the quiet prayers offered in the tents as the men lay down to sleep and attempt the one thing war never teaches: rest. People would come to Silas over the years with a strange belief that this moment could define them, that it could absolve or condemn them, that the bullet had given them a future that was no longer a choice but a destiny. He did not accept that. He believed that life was a chain of choices, each a small hinge that would swing open or close a door, each an act of courage or fear or both. The day's action was a hinge, but the door was not yet opened or shut for him. He remained in the space between what had happened and what would be asked of him in the months and years ahead. And somewhere beyond the edge of the field, where the smoke of the day still clung to the air like a memory the earth refused to forget, Sedgwick's death, if it was to be called such, became a complicated chapter in a larger, more uncertain book. The last words of the general, a line that would be repeated in taverns and quartermasters' tents, would eventually echo through the land, not as a boast or a confession, but as a cautionary tale about distance and danger and the humbling truth that even the mightiest can be toppled by a single precise act. In the quiet moments of his life after the war, Silas did not tell his children or his grandchildren the exact truth of what had happened that day, the way the wind carried the powder's scent, the way the ground gave way beneath his own feet. As a mark was made, the feeling of being the instrument of a moment that would shape futures he could not yet foresee, he spoke instead of discipline and patience, and the stubborn belief that one's duty, whatever it may be, carries more weight than any single triumph or failure. He spoke of the river of history that runs beneath every battlefield, a river that can drown or shelter a man, depending on which way the current pulls him. And yet the memory persisted, returning in odd, almost unbidden ways. The way the grass or the mud of a particular field would remind him of the morning when distance was a lie, and a man named Sedgwick became the symbol of a line that could be crossed by nothing but the cold, unerring arithmetic of a bullet. The days rolled on, the war's smoke thickened, and the world moved on as the living learned to live with the weight of a single decision and the undeniable testament of a line drawn across the soul of a field, across the mind of a nation, across the record of a day when a Confederate shooter's choice would pass into legend, and the general's last words would be etched into the memory of a people who would never quite forget the distance between belief and consequence. The moment of truth, the moment when Sedgwick fell, has become, in the long, patient way memory travels, a lesson that is passed between veterans like a coin changed hands in a somber ceremony. A reminder that distance is a weapon and a trap. That skill can be a road to power and a road to ruin, and that the line between courage and foolish risk is a line drawn in mud and smoke on a field that has seen more of history than most towns ever do. The battlefield has its own way of speaking, a language of noise and quiet and the smell of steel and rain and the sorrow of men who have learned to live with the truth that a moment's exactness can echo for a lifetime. And through it all, Silas Crow remained the quiet center of the storm, a man who could walk away from the edge of a grave, and still carry the memory of the moment with the simple, stubborn calm of one who knew that the world would demand more of him in days to come. More patience, more discipline, more courage, and more honesty about the weight of a single well-placed shot. The day closed with a light dimming in the western sky, the smell of damp earth rising from the ground, and the sound of the distant drums thinning to a dry whisper. The field, now a memory of grass and mud, lay quiet again, heavy, almost reverent, as if it wished to forget the blood while the people who had stood there wished to remember. And then, the moment that mattered most, the line that would endure in memory, the words that would be spoken in whispers when the night was heavy, and the men, far from that field and its smoke, tried to make